All right, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at Count Paul Yorck von Wartenburg.
Yorck.
Yeah, so this was a listener request, and it's a good one. I think this will be really interesting. This is one of those figures who maybe isn't a household name.
Right.
But looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia entry and all the other stuff that you sent over, his ideas are actually pretty influential, especially for people interested in history.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited to dive into this.
Yeah, this should be a good one. There's a lot of great stuff to unpack.
Yeah, just from that initial overview reading, I mean, he seemed to be really ahead of his time in some ways, especially with this emphasis on historicity.
Yeah.
And Geschichtlichkeit, which is a really fascinating concept.
It is. And I think he, along with Dilthey, really helped sort of bring this into focus.
Right.
This idea that, like, not just events unfold in time, but that our being itself is historical.
Yeah.
That we're fundamentally shaped by the currents of history.
And it's not just sort of a passive shaping.
Right.
It's like a fundamental part of what it means to be human, according to him.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is. And one of the other things that jumped out at me from the initial reading is this sort of critical perspective on traditional metaphysics.
Right.
This idea that we're pursuing these timeless truths, outside of history.
Right.
And it seemed like he was really pushing against that and bringing in this concept of a historical and personal transcendent God.
Yeah.
Which is really intriguing.
Yeah.
And it's within a Lutheran framework.
Yeah, that's sort of the background that he's coming from. And the interesting thing is, if you want to understand Yorck, you really have to kind of piece together his thought from various sources.
Yeah.
So he wasn't somebody who published extensively during his life.
Right.
We know him primarily through his correspondence with Dilthey, which was published posthumously, I think, in 1923.
Yeah.
And then various fragments and things like that have been collected and put together. So it's almost like we're trying to piece together a brilliant conversation, more so than sort of like reading a treatise.
Yeah, that makes it all the more interesting. I think it's like a little bit of a puzzle.
Absolutely.
And then looking at his background, he came from a very prominent Prussian family.
Yeah.
Very connected to literary and philosophical and artistic circles.
Right.
He managed the family estate. He was involved in political life.
Yeah.
And he really witnessed a lot of significant historical events firsthand. So that probably contributed to
without a doubt
to his
it's fertile ground for his thought, I think.
to his deep interest in history.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, that really leads us nicely to that first discussion point, this significance of the Dilthey correspondence.
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because it's not just sort of an interesting side note to Dilthey's work.
Right.
It really does establish Yorck as a philosophical voice in his own right.
Yeah. And what's particularly insightful, I think, from the correspondence is how Yorck saw his own time. Like, back in 1892, he was writing to Dilthey about a sense of end of an epoch.
Wow.
And that this was a historical turning point, similar to, he said, the 15th century.
Right.
Where there was a kind of a fading of this elemental pleasure in historical realities.
That's interesting.
This kind of Gefühl der Vergänglichkeit, this sense of that everything passes.
Mm-hmm.
And but he saw in this also the potential for renewal, for this return to the whole human being facing life's problems. Right. So not just this purely scientific technological approach.
Right.
That had become too narrow, right? And we needed to kind of
reevaluate what truth is.
Yeah, reevaluate what truth is. And he was, very critical of the modern era, going all the way back to the Renaissance. This idea that the emphasis on science and knowledge, when it's cut off from feeling and will, can lead to self-alienation.
Yeah.
And he has that great line, modern man, that is man since the Renaissance, is fit for the grave.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a pretty powerful indictment of...
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets really interesting for a philosopher.
Right.
Because, this is decades before World War I.
Yeah.
This is decades before all of the turmoil of the 20th century.
Right.
And yet he's already sort of sensing this epochal shift.
Yeah.
And so when that correspondence comes out, in the 1920s,
it's huge.
It's a huge deal. And it really makes sense why someone like Gadamer much later would describe the publication of that correspondence as an epoch-making moment.
Absolutely. I mean, it really struck a chord. And I think particularly for thinkers like Heidegger, who are really struggling with these questions of being and time, And I think that takes us really nicely into that concept of historicity.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
That Yorck really lays out.
Yeah, because for him, it's not just, philosophy is this detached intellectual exercise.
No, it's a manifestation of life.
It's a manifestation of life, a Lebens manifestation.
Lebens manifestation.
And at the very core of this life is this historicity.
Yeah.
Life is inseparable from its historical unfolding for him.
And he has that great quote, "The entire psychophysical reality is not something that is, but something that lives. That is the germ cell of historicity. And self-reflection, which is directed not at an abstract I, but at the entirety of my own self, will find that I am historically determined, just as physics grasps me as determined by the cosmos, just as I am nature, I am history."
Wow.
It's powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where that distinction between the ontic and the historical comes in, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the ontic is this permanent, unchanging aspect.
Right.
And the historical is characterized by this constant change, this flux.
Yeah, the temporality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he insisted that human existence is life.
Right.
Not mere existence in that ontic sense.
It's ghastly.
And I think that's a really important distinction for him.
It is. And he sees history as the unfolding of human psychology.
Right.
Not just like, okay, these events happen, but it's like,
it's about our understanding.
How is our understanding,
our emotions,
our will developing over time, shaped by historical experience.
Yeah. And he also talks about this really interesting concept of virtuality or effectivity of history.
Yeah.
Which is the way that, past individuals, past generations, their actions,
right,
their influences,
their
sacrifices are transmitted, across time, and they subtly shape the possibilities of those who come after.
He uses that great example of the mother sacrificing for the child.
Right.
That
the Kraftübertragung.
The transmission of power.
Yeah.
And that this is how history actually works.
Yeah.
That it's not just this sort of abstract force.
Right.
But it's the actual, often very intimate influence of individuals, their authority, their sacrifices, their communication, shaping future generations. And this is why he says that person is the key historical category.
Right.
That the individual is this active agent who's...
Yeah, it's not just these abstract, impersonal historical forces.
No. And then this leads to his critique of the transcendental method.
Right.
Because he's saying, look, the transcendental method focuses on the structures of the subjective mind, but it misses this real historical extension of Geist, spirit or mind.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, to understand Geist, you have to look at the concrete realm of history.
Right.
And that's why he says that substance is history or substance is historical spirit.
Right.
It's a pretty radical rethinking.
Yeah, so it's not just, dismissing metaphysics.
Right.
It's this call for a complete historicization of philosophy itself.
Yeah, Geschichtlichung. Right. This idea that, just as physiology can't abstract from physics.
Right.
Philosophy, especially critical philosophy,
right,
can't abstract from historicity,
right,
from Geschichtlichkeit.
Geschichtlichkeit, yeah.
And so that leads to this really interesting methodological point,
right,
which is his rejection of that hard division between theoretical philosophy and the history of ideas.
Right.
Because he sees these things as intertwined, as mutually informing and enriching each other within this kind of continuous historical development of thought.
Yeah, and he says that we should approach philosophy critically.
Right.
Rather than antiquarian.
Exactly.
So it's not just about, studying the past for its own sake.
No.
It's about engaging with it to understand its relevance for the present.
Right.
And its practical implications.
And its deeply pedagogical intent.
Right.
He sees philosophy as shaping our fundamental understanding of life and our place within it.
Yeah. And he even connects that back to the original spirit of philosophy.
He does. And it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So we've kind of explored his critique of metaphysics, this call for the historicization of philosophy.
Right.
Now let's move to his later work.
Okay.
Especially Stances of Consciousness and History.
Right.
And here his focus shifts to the underlying psychology of human life.
Okay.
As the basis for historical development.
Okay.
So he's really interested in how different stances of consciousness
right.
or fundamental configurations in our psychology
Right.
determine the overarching character of different historical epochs.
Okay. And this is really interesting for a philosopher.
Yes.
Because, he's saying that it's not just about these external forces of history.
Yeah.
It's about the internal landscape of experience.
Yeah. That's the fundamental driver of historical change.
Yeah.
And he places a huge emphasis on self-besinnum, self-reflection, as the way that we can access this deep psychological life.
Right.
And so philosophy, in a sense, becomes empirical, because it's grounded in the direct empirical givenness of self-consciousness.
Right.
And he says, one cannot surpass or transcend the empirical givenness of self-consciousness, which entails that philosophy is empirical, not speculative.
Right.
So he sees consciousness as a dynamic living structure,
Right.
where Lebendigkeit, aliveness, is paramount.
Right.
And this encompasses not just knowing and willing, but also this deep self-awareness and this kind of felt quality of our inner lives.
Right.
He even resonates with Schleiermacher.
Right.
And identifying Lebensgefühl, the feeling of life, as the ultimate foundation of self-consciousness.
Yeah.
And then he describes life itself as differenzierte Einheitlichkeit.
The differentiated unity.
Expressed through this inner division and polarity, especially the primary separation between self and other.
Right.
He goes so far as to say, the self is only through the other, just as the other is only through the self.
Right.
So there's this kind of profound interconnectedness, even in this initial differentiation.
Yeah.
And then this fundamental polarity manifests in the three functions or comportments, the Verhaltungen of life.
Right.
So we have feeling, empfinden, willing, wollen, and cognizing, vorstellen.
Right.
And within each of these, there's this crucial underlying tension between spontaneity and dependence. So for feeling, it's the interplay between our dependence on others and our own sense of self. We're willing. It's between our motivations and our spontaneous actions. And for cognizing, it's between the objective representation and this sort of spontaneous projection of our own interpretations and images. So he sees these three functions as the fixed natural ground upon which this whole edifice of human history unfolds. So the functions themselves remain constant. But their prominence, their interplay is in perpetual flux. And he says, this inherent restlessness of primary life, this is the motor of history. And then he makes this interesting distinction that willing and cognition are eccentric. They're directed outwards toward objects in the world, whereas feeling is inward focused. And he says that spatialization is key to representation and thought. We think in terms of things being out there. Whereas temporality, our experience of time, originates in feeling.
And this inner awareness of change and transience. And he says spatiality is the basic character of all thought. So the very act of thinking involves spatializing, placing things in relation to one another in a mental space. Whereas temporality is tied to the internal experience of feeling this constant flux and flow of our inner states.
So it's this distinction between
between inner and outer.
Cognition is sort of outward striving, to understand the world.
And he sees it as a form of liberation. It creates this psychological distance from things. It diminishes their immediate power over us. And he links this to this ethical drive for self-affirmation. Achieving freedom and autonomy through understanding and mastering the external world. Whereas feeling is the very awareness of our inwardness.
Comes the seat of the personal, the unique, and the origin of this profound awareness of transitoriness and mortality. And this leads to Selbstverleugnung, self-renunciation, which is a kind of acceptance of our finitude that he sees as the foundation of a religious comportment
Right.
This feeling of dependency and transcendence.
Okay.
So it's this very interesting contrast.
Yeah. Okay.
He's drawing between the outward striving of cognition
Right.
and the inward acceptance inherent in feeling.
Okay.
So how does this actually play out in history?
Yeah, let's talk about the turning points.
The turning points. He outlines 3 decisive turning points in the history of life.
Okay.
And each one is characterized by the dominance of one of these stances.
Okay.
So first you have the Greek world.
Right.
And here he sees the primacy of cognition.
Okay.
It's this pure-looking...
this aesthetic attitude.
Right.
That seeks the unchanging essence in metaphysics.
Right.
And he argues that this was partly a way of suppressing the disruptive forces of feeling and willing.
Okay.
The negation of temporality becomes a key metaphysical strategy.
Yeah.
Looking is the essential comportment. Hence, Gestalt or form qualifies as ousia or substance.
Right.
So it's like, okay.
They're trying to find truth in this objective contemplation.
In objective contemplation,
Yeah.
And then we shift to the Roman and the Jewish world.
Right.
Where he sees a predominance of willing.
Okay.
So in the Jewish world, it's temporality projected into the future as messianic hope.
Right.
In the Roman world, it's this pursuit of power that's locked in immanence.
Okay.
Oblivious to time and death.
Right. You have the eternal city.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Versus the crosses of the early Christians as signs of transcendence.
Right.
So he says, regarding the Jewish perspective, whereas the Greek metaphysical cast of mind abstracts from temporality, temporality is the determining element in the Hebrew world.
Right.
And for the Roman, just might is everything.
Right.
So it's very interesting to see him kind of juxtapose these.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have Christianity, which marks the focal centrality of feeling and interiority.
Right.
So here he sees what he calls absolute aliveness and supreme historicity achieved through a conscious freedom from the world and a profoundly personal felt relationship with a transcendent God.
Yeah.
So here Selbstverleugnung, self-renunciation, becomes absolutely key.
Right.
This turning inwards and acceptance of finitude.
Right.
And he even suggests that that Luther, with this emphasis on personal faith and inner experience, understood this breakthrough in consciousness far better than people like Kant and Schleiermacher. He says, he writes to Dilthey, "You will not agree when I say that Luther should and must be more topical to the present time than Kant."
Right.
So for Yorck, Christianity in this, by elevating this deeply personal felt experience, paradoxically unlocks a more profound engagement with time and history. So it's this counterintuitive but fascinating idea.
Yeah, it's like by turning inward, by embracing our finitude, we actually become more attuned to the flow. And the dynamic flow of historical existence.
Exactly. And it's almost like, being released from these rigid projections of objective knowledge and the anxious expectations of the future.
Right.
Frees us to live more fully in the present. Right? Within the natural temporal rhythm of life.
Right.
Grounded in this personal relationship with the transcendent.
Yeah. Okay. So I think bringing it all together, Yorck's really emphasizing this historicity as fundamental to being human.
Right.
His critique of metaphysics for denying this.
Yeah.
And then this really fascinating analysis of consciousness.
Yeah.
And how its different stances or dominant stances actively shape the course of history.
Right.
I mean, he's really giving us a unique lens, I think.
A unique lens.
In which to examine this relationship between our inner experience, the passage of time, and the unfolding of these historical events.
And for a philosopher, I think it's just such a powerful reminder of this deeply historical constitution of our being and our modes of understanding. So, even when we're thinking about these, these big philosophical questions, we always have to be aware of the historical context that we're embedded in.
Yeah. Wow. This has been a really thought-provoking dive.
Yeah, Yorck's a fascinating thinker.
He is. And it leaves us with a final thought, a provocative thought for our listener. If, as Yorck says, even fundamental categories like being are ultimately a result of life, how does that challenge our traditional ontological frameworks?
Right.
These frameworks that try to find these timeless ahistorical foundations for being, for truth.
Right.
What does it mean if our very ways of understanding are historically contingent?
Yeah.
And not these immutable absolutes?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. It is. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this dive. We'll see you next time.